All right, everyone. Welcome to the open final of Astana Eudc Online. Congratulations to all of the teams for having made it thus far into the tournament. So my name's Lucia, and I'll be your chair. Preferred pronoun is she, but please refer to the panel as a whole. And joining me in the panel are Lover, Lucy, Melda, Milos, Rafi, and Dasso, Sebastian. So without further ado, seeing as we all know the teams that are in the open final, we'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to begin his speech that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Can everybody hear me? Cool. 3, 2, 1. Firstly, our model is that we allow this all the time. You can do this on the spot. You can do that before the action takes place. For example, before a protest takes place, you are allowed. We are not going to judge you whenever you're doing it. However, we don't think this is going to happen very often. Firstly, because policemen always believe that they have a duty towards their country and have a duty, like a general duty to follow orders, although their conscience can outweigh that. Secondly, there's training. So you know you're going to be there's training that you should follow orders, and you know the importance of following orders. So in general, you know this. 3, there is trust within a police community, in a police sort of a group, and you know you cannot screw your policeman over, and that will enter into your calculus and when you think about your conscience. So you don't necessarily do this all the time. You don't necessarily going to bring all the policemen in danger, but you are going to do this when you definitely think that this is problematic. 3 points. 1, autonomy of individual policemen. Secondly, why policemen overall will handle things better. And thirdly, there's a fly on my camera, why following orders is why refusing these specific orders which are going to be refused is usually better than following them. Firstly, autonomy of individual policemen. Firstly, you're literally forcing orders to use force against people. This is not a democratic choice which the government and parliament chose. This is just an order from someone who is like a little bit higher on your ranking. This is a split decision. This is not democratically elected, and we have no idea why you can force on someone to do something that's against their conscience. We think that is horrible. These people are literally that's just evil. Even if they say that they chose to be on the police force, so you can do, you didn't know everything in advance. The political landscape might change when you become a police officer. You might have loyalty, and you don't necessarily want to go. We don't necessarily think that you should be forced to do to harm citizens, to harm people that in your community when you don't want to do that. We think this is incredibly important. If the rest is a wash, you should decide on this. Secondly, why are police officers in general going to be nicer? Firstly, now it is very easy to have groupthink. So every time you don't feel individual responsibility, because you can always say, I was just following orders. That means that you're going to be morally divorced from what you do, from the outcomes of that. So you're going to think this is not necessarily something that was a result of your action, but it is a result of the orders that were given to you, which you have to follow in every circumstance, and otherwise you're going to be punished. So you're not going to think for yourself. There's also no reason to think for yourself at the outset. So the problem is in groupthink, in police office constituencies, you can get an incredibly racist groups and nobody thinking individually for themselves what they're doing. Our policy means that you're constantly forced to think about it. You see other policemen doing this. You see other policemen sort of making that decision. You know that this is something that you can do and that you should do. And it's also a part of your duty as a police officer to do this for yourself. That means that you're not going to go with this groupthink. That means that we can stop the worst kinds of cases of police brutality where people only think what the group is thinking and only following orders. We are not having that on our side of the house. If you don't think that sort of the orders are better or worse than the individual trade-off that a policeman can make, you can decide to debate on this. We think that you should propose. Why are the orders refused more likely to be bad than good? 3 reasons. Firstly, there's greater distance between the person making that decision, giving that order, than a policeman on the street. So a policeman on the street can know what a protest looks like, can know what a person who was sort of arrested for having drugs looks like and what their situation is. You know that that's the poor person person, if you arrest them, you know they're going to be in jail, then they're going to go out of jail and going to be in jail again. As a police officer, you can't say, look, I'm not willing to participate in that. And we think that's usually the good choice because you have more information and you also have experience as a police officer. That is great. Secondly, usually the people who get promoted and give these orders are older conservative people who were promoted by even more conservative people. That means that they usually have a tendency to not care as much about minorities and younger people who are usually in the police force. So you get that much more on our side of the house. We think that's more beneficial. They're more in line with the general society and what they think, and their conscience is also more in line with the general society. Thirdly, you don't get politicized ideas and politicized orders on or corrupt orders. What you get on opposition side is the orders being given by someone who is more likely to be corrupt because they are influenced by, for example, property development on where they have to arrest a lot of people. And you don't get that on our side of the house where policemen, individual policemen are less likely to be corrupt. That is nice. But secondly, you get extremely politicized orders. What does that look like? Because the person who is giving the orders, it has to answer to the person above. That means that you get extremely politicized orders. Why is this bad? Because politics is usually really bad at deciding criminal policy or how to respond to a protest, usually not decided very well by a government because they only have the incentive to crack down as hard to make it stop so that they don't look bad. That is extremely bad, but it's not a trade-off that is necessarily good, right? Because you always have to, because there are easy solutions which the populace, which the general people support, such as arresting literally everybody who has 1 gram of weed with them, which don't make lives better, which make lives significantly worse. On our side of the house, you get policemen who refuse that. We think they are sometimes likely to do that because sometimes people are willing to make that decision. They see the harms of their own individual actions, and now they're constantly asked to do this. I want a PY from CL.
Given that we send police officers into a life or death situation, do you think it's acceptable to send them in with unreliable partners?
Okay, even if the policeman is harmed, 1, they trust the risk, 2, they have the duty, thirdly, they can protect themselves where other people can't. If you are attacking as a police officer protesters, they don't necessarily have that. We think the trade-off falls on our side of the house. Even if they say you can send in other policemen who might be worse, I think 1, they're not worse because you're morally diverse and therefore they're not necessarily worse and emotions take over in this split second. Secondly, you cannot always have other policemen because, for example, in a protest, fighting that means that you need a lot of people and you cannot always give the same orders. There you get different orders because you see that this happens. It's extremely humiliating. You know you're not going to get a promotion if your officers are constantly refusing your orders. That means you'll give different orders which are more in line with the general population, which are not based on corruption, which is not based on stupid policy that the politics on that moment likes. You give different orders, and we also like that these are not individual policemen who are beating the shit out of people who did nothing. Therefore, propose.
We thank the speaker for that speech, and now we'd like to welcome the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for the up in the debate. Hear, hear.
Is your timer over? Yes. Okay. 1 moment, I have the timer. Okay. 3. We think that at the point where you are allowing the policeman to refuse orders on the reason of conscience, it is much more likely that the responsibility in terms of the system is going to be put on the individual police officer rather than on the system. We think it is much more likely that the system is the one that is broken. It is much more important that we have the tools to hold it accountable and to fix it, because it's unlikely to be the certain police officer. We're going to talk about how this shifting of responsibility happens, and we're going to talk about the negative outcomes that this has. First of all, a few points of rebuttal. Look, It's evil to for someone to do something against their conscience. Notice that anyone who works for the state is beholden to the democratic powers of the state. If I'm going to be a judge, I might have to judge according to laws that I don't personally agree with. If I'm going to be a public defender, I'm going to have to prosecute for cases which I do not personally believe are going according to my values, because these are the laws that have been decided by the majority. If I'm working inside any government ministry, I have to do what the minister is telling me and what the parliament is telling me, even if I think that the ideology that is being pushed through with these systems that I'm told to develop is not an ideology that I agree with. This idea that someone can't consent to be in a job where they're doing a public service and thus are giving up some of the right in order to fulfill this public service is just bogus, and we think that we wouldn't accept it in any other setting, and we don't accept it here either. Then they tell us you can't think for yourself, right? So we want to talk about two different situations. First of all, we think that if this is an order you've been given in advance, this doesn't hinder people's ability to think for themselves at all. If you think in advance that something is being done wrong, you always can come and complain to someone who's more senior, come and complain to the department that is doing investigations in the police and make sure that the thing is not happening. We think that the relevant cases in this debate are therefore the cases where you are actually in a police action at the moment and decided you don't want to partake in something that your commander tells you to do. We think that probably in these cases, it is not good for you to think for yourself, right? We think that for every crime they tell you, look, maybe the police officer is not going to be. Yeah. Okay. Am I audible now?
You are now, but the last 10
we
seconds
can hear
maybe
now. Why is
it's
that?
over.
Okay. Now we can also hear other people. Okay. Apologies for internet trouble.
Okay.
I will continue. Yeah. Okay. So I paused it around 2 minutes on my watch. Correct?
Yeah, that's fine. That's correct.
Okay, good. So for any police officer that thinks, oh, we shouldn't, prosecute people for holding marijuana, there's probably another police officer who thinks violence against women isn't a real problem, or they shouldn't protect minorities. We really don't know which case is more relevant. We do know that in general, the police is going to work according to the laws dictated by the state, and therefore these are probably the people who should be able to make the decision as in any other government office. But we also think that it's very important for the police officers to know that they can reliably work together, right? You need, when you're on the ground and doing police action, if one police officer suddenly decides they don't want to partake in the action, that makes it much more likely that the people you're trying to chase get away, that someone with a gun can actually threaten the other people because you didn't see they have a gun and you're like, no, I don't want to shoot them, but the other police officer who's your commander actually noticed that they have a gun and that is why they're telling you to shoot. At the point where you don't shoot them, you're putting all the other police officers in danger, right? We think that the reason you have a commander in the police force is because you know that he can take care of all the information and factor things in, and because you need a single head making the decisions, because you need to make sure that the people are unified. Lastly, we just want to know about police brutality, that often the people who are doing police brutality are doing it against the rules, and we think that this is not something that they've been ordered to do. We think that also police brutality is really probably a big problem in countries that are actively not doing things to stop it, like the United States. We think that many other countries have more diversity in the police force, have more better training, and have better things like that. And just police brutality is not a wide problem. We think that probably this means that the United States has other ways to solve its stupid police force. Let's talk about shifting of responsibility. We think that, look, the moment that you're allowed to do this, so first of all, on the police level, there's obviously an incentive to make sure that the more less senior people are the ones that get all the blame, right? Because first of all, the senior people are the ones that are making the decision within the police force. Second of all, it's much more embarrassing for the police, the more senior the person who is making the mistake. And because we think that probably they are just, they got to be seniors because the people in the police force think that they are meaningful and important. And we think that they don't want to take away their responsibilities, right? So that means they are likely to shift the blame as much as they can on the personal police officer, right? We also think the media is likely to focus on the personal police officer because it's much easier, first of all, to demonize the person who actually pulled the trigger, to say, here is the correct cause. This is something that's very easy to identify and to say, he's the one who should have done, otherwise he's the one who holds the blame, right? We also think that the police officers know that everybody else knows that they have this option too. Refuse, and that means that if they did not refuse, they know that they are going to be blamed. Everybody, their friends, their families, their colleagues will be like, you're going to be blamed. Before we continue to talk about the terrible harms that accrue to the police force, I will take Siji's POI.
Why are officers not judged today for police brutality?
We think in most developed countries they are. We think the United States is an extreme case, which for some reason, for many political reasons, has decided it does not want to solve police brutality. And if it had a political will, it could do this like any other developed nation. You take away qualified immunity, you have more diversity in the police force, you have better training, and all of these things. We think that that's just not a real problem. Let's talk about homicide, because we think that, first of all, that means that you have much less incentive to complain when bad things happen and when there is cases of police brutality or bad things. Why is that? Because we think that OG is correct in telling you their analysis, and notice that this is analysis they already give you, therefore all the teams in the debate concede to this, that the police officer is very unlikely to refuse in the vast majority of cases, because there is a lot of pressure to do the thing that my officer tells me, because this is what my colleagues expect of me, because I trust that the police commander is smarter than I am, because usually the bad things that happen are going to be part of some larger culture of bad things. Right? We think that that means that at the point where I know that I'm very likely to be blamed for the things that have happened, and probably I didn't refuse on the ground, but I need to complain to them after the fact, I'm much less likely to do it, because I'm much more likely to be blamed for having done nothing, for not trying to change it, for why did you not refuse? There's going to be much more personal cost to me in terms of my colleagues and my family and my future employment. And as a result, this means we're not getting all the problems out there in the air. We think if OG wants to solve the problem of senior officials who are corrupt and of things like and racist and things like that, you must actually know the information in order to solve this, and we are not getting the information on their side, right? But we also think that the fact that it's so easy to throw the blame on the individual police officer who needed to refuse and did not refuse, which is much easier than putting blame on seniors, which, as we said, you don't want to put blame on them. That means there is much less attention to the systemic problems within the system, right? We think that probably if a senior police officer is giving a bad comment, he's giving many other bad comments, and we think many other officers in the same station are also giving bad comments. This is not something someone does just on the spur of the moment. If it's one small mistake and that's the only one mistake they do in their life, this is less important, right? And we think that the systemic reasons are exactly the type of things like having qualified immunity, having no diversity in your police station, the types of ammunition that you are allowed to use, the rules of engagement, and the type of training that people get. At the point where people blame the specific police officer, you don't actually investigate, and therefore you don't uncover the systemic reasons. For all these reasons, we think we get better police force on our side. Please pause.
Thank the speaker for their remarks, and to continue the case for side government, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. 3, 2, 1. First, on engagement with opening government. I think 2 points that I think are relatively reasonable to remove. The idea that you are equally unwilling to act on an order about violence against women as to arrest a child or a teenager for dealing weed is implausible. 1, because ultimately violence against women is something that triggers oftentimes in us a visceral response that this is wrong. There is nothing inherent biological in humans that thinks a drug is something that is wrong to use. I think we, however, respond incredibly poorly, and we want to change something at the point where someone is being physically harmed, where they are being beaten up, where there is a victim and someone who is victimizing them. I think this is an incredibly strong impulse that is significantly stronger than the impulse to arrest or not to arrest someone for drugs. But secondly, I think you are just selfishly likelier to err on the side of caution, because I think it is significantly less likely that you are going to be held individually liable for having not arrested a kid for weed. At the point where, however, you have to tell, say, your wife that you didn't arrest someone and because you chose on conscience that someone beating their wife is not a bad thing, I think you are probably likely to experience selfishly important social consequences. Secondly, I think on the idea that this destroys trust and efficacy within police forces, which I think comes out of CO's POI and also somewhat of opening opposition. What are responses to that? 1, I think specifically with regard to like in individual actions where you are structurally dependent on each other, I think Louis already points out there's a strong counter incentive to leaving people that you think need you specifically to be safe. I think that is presumably not the situation in protest where there's basically like a police army out there where one single person leaving is not decisive and it is specifically them acting on their conscience. But at the point where there is a life or death situation that you know is life or death and you think that carrying it out is morally in any sense defensible, you're probably going to do it. If, however, however, you don't think it is morally defensible, I think that is a way of that you make, given the fact that you know your colleague is going to die, at which point I think the way of that would need to exist for that is that someone else is going to die. And we have no reason to prefer the life of a police officer being saved over the life of a non-police officer who never consented necessarily into violence being saved. I think specifically, Louis already gives you a weighing for why we would prioritize civilians insofar as they are generally speaking less able to defend themselves. But two more responses to the notion of trust within police forces. Given the fact that you consider this within your decision making, I think you're likely to have conversations with your fellow police officers about it. You're likely to discuss what is on your conscience, and you are likely to specifically address what you are willing to deal with. I think it also gives you leverage vis-a-vis your commander, second mechanism, to inform them at the point where multiple of you socially agree that something that has previously been an order is unconscionable, to bring that up and have that changed. By the way, orders changing, was in Louis, no response. That's mildly sad. Talking about the last thing they have in terms of actually effectively fixing police, because we need to focus on the system. One, I think you are significantly likelier to focus on the system when you have individuals saying, this was asked of me and I didn't do it. I think this is something that means they are of a massively stronger moral position in front of society than someone saying, this was asked of me and I did it. Because the moment that you did it, you are a hypocrite. You are someone who's only now speaking up for media attention. You are someone who was willing to violate someone, but is now willing to but is now trying to push off the blame on their superior. I think that's a weak moral position. There's a stronger moral position at the point where you refuse because you thought it was wrong. But secondly, I think it is incorrect ultimately that this is not the fault of the individual police officer, because ultimately you are still the one who pulled the trigger. And I think specifically putting that responsibility on every single person who is ever in that situation and making them aware of the fact that they are personally culpable for doing immoral things is structurally important for making them consider not doing them even when there is an order to do it, because an order is just not fucking good enough as an excuse, and people shouldn't believe that it is. Lastly, I think ultimately, in terms of the idea that you don't complain after the fact because you think that you will be held personally responsible, I think you already are morally held responsible for having acted in an unconscionable way to the degree that you are anyway. I think the change that you should have done better and that you should have done differently is much likelier to motivate you in the individual situation where you think that something is so morally disgusting that you're willing to disappoint your superiors and your friends, because you are so morally compelled by that, because you have empathy telling you not to do something. I think that is more likely where that influences your decision point than 2 years after, where you're thinking of maybe should I talk about the fact that this was wrong or not. Yep, that was responses. Let's talk about individual accountability. I think individual accountability gets significantly better results for police officers, but secondly, I think it is also the correct reflection of the autonomy they have in terms of carrying out their decisions. One, they reflect on what they would be willing to do or not. I think this is something that is incredibly important, because right now as a police officer, oftentimes you don't, because you know that you will have an order and you will have to carry it out unless you want to lose your job, to go to prison. Oftentimes penalties for failing to follow orders and status quo are quite extreme. That means you are better off not thinking about it, because at the point where you have thought about it and made a mental commitment not to do something, that means you would be in a much worse position when that thing is asked of you. Secondly, now you have a fear of judgment. You have a fear of people looking at you as the person who did this. You have a fear of being individually, morally called out for it. I think that's incredibly useful in terms of making people think about it in advance, thinking about it in the moment, because this is something that is incredibly useful for motivating behavior. Lastly, I think it is integrated into your moral framework. And I think your moral framework, specifically in the moment, is usually quite good, because humans are empathetic. We understand if someone is suffering and it makes us sad. That increases with proximity to the suffering. It decreases with being someone in a room somewhere who's likely been bought out by a local politician and has no reason to care. Secondly, I think that ultimately you are likely to be not wanting to think of yourself as racist, not wanting to think of yourself as an unfair being. And when you have to directly carry out an action, as opposed to giving a generalized order that is likely to dictate what you are going to do, I think people are able to do different, and we should be aware of the fact that it's fucking wrong to collaborate with orders that are evil. It should be people's individual job to evaluate this at every single point that they do so.
Orders and discretion are not well democratically legitimized when it comes to criminal justice. One, because there's often a very limited option set on the table due to the political incentives that no one wants to be soft on crime. Two, because the correct solutions to it are oftentimes so counterintuitive that they never enter the ballot. That means that oftentimes the degree to which people had a democratic choice in terms of what they endorse is incredibly limited. Secondly, individuals who give orders are almost never democratically legitimized. That means you're effectively just telling someone to do something because someone thought you would be good at that job. That is not a good enough mechanism. Ultimately, we get better orders on our side, less violent orders, less morally reprehensible orders. We get less groupthink. We have police departments that are actively thinking about what is right and what is wrong, what they are willing and not to enforce. I think ultimately the mechanism for that is better in opening government. Vote OG.
Thank the speaker for that speech. And now to conclude for opening opposition, we welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, widespread police brutality does not spring out of nowhere. It does not come from every single individual policeman randomly deciding that they have lost all of their empathy, that all the mechanisms that OG tell you about suddenly don't exist in their brain and they've all become psychopaths. Police brutality at the level that we've seen, at the level that needs to be changed, comes from systemic, widespread lack of proper training, lack of proper diversity, lack of proper accountability mechanisms. We want to put the focus there because that is the only way in which we actually solve these problems. So proud to oppose. I'm going to talk to you about this in terms of talking about how we engage with those widespread problems and why we're stopping the largest cases of police brutality on our side. And then we're going to talk about the efficacy of the police and why this is illegitimate and unproductive harm to them. Let's start by dealing with this. How do we actually stop this? Because Netta gets up and she tells you the problem that we have here is with the systemic issues, right? As we said, this does not magically spring out of nowhere. You don't magically get tons of police officers and police brutality the level at which we've seen it. And if we think that there are a few individual cases of individual police officers who have lost their empathy, who have lost their understanding, if the system is correct and the accountability mechanisms are in place, then they will be held accountable inside their own police force anyway, right? The problem, therefore, has to be systemic. What are the systemic problems that have led to the horrors that we've seen in the United States and in other places across the world? We're talking about the lack of proper training and the lack of an understanding and like keeping people from being trigger happy and ways in which they engage with that. We're talking about the lack of diversity on the police force. We're talking about the kinds of ammunition and guns that they're told to go out with and into which situations, such that they inherently, when they have to shoot, are going to kill innocent people. We're talking about the way in which you have active accountability mechanisms that are allowed to work and people don't get punished for telling on their friends and moved down and demoted in their jobs. We're talking about all of those things, and we're telling you that we don't solve them on government's side of the house. Why is this, and why did we just not get sufficient responses to this by any means? One, Netta tells you that when you do this and when you put the accountability on the person, as opening government are the ones who are telling you this is what you're doing now, this is the change that is happening in terms of the perception both for the person themselves and for the media. That is where they focus. That is who they interview. That is who they say, you are the person, you are the last part. You shouldn't have pulled the trigger. You shouldn't have made that decision. We think that that becomes the story instead of focusing on the widespread problems, instead of focusing on the fact, the super non-interesting, non-sexy story of the fact that the training just wasn't good enough, of the fact that there wasn't enough diversity on the police. That is much less interesting than talking about the person who murdered someone else. You don't get that accountability. Second of all, we tell you that the people at the top push this problem onto these individuals. They say, look, we gave the order, we thought it was reasonable, In fact, it makes sense. Look, this person on the ground still did the thing. They're the ones who took the action. They had the most information, as opening government are telling you themselves. So it's not our fault. Obviously, if he also agreed with us, it must mean that it made sense in the moment, that it was a reasonable thing to do. You ignore the problems that systematically happen at the top. Thirdly, we tell you these people are much less likely to come forward, because what happens is, at opening government analyze this to themselves, people are very, very, very unlikely to refuse orders in the moment. In fact, we think they're often very unlikely to refuse orders at all, because of the training that they're getting, and because of the fact that they have accountability to their friends, and because of the fact that they're going to face condemnation, all of these things. What this means is that in the moment and in the split second in which you're making this decision, you cannot let down your friend in this moment. You don't know what you're doing. You haven't decided, but after the fact, the next day, the next week, you might actually recognize this was a terrible order that I was given. But when the responsibility seems to have been on me as opening government once so badly, that is the point at which I am much less likely to report on it. And so even if once I report, I'm seen as a hypocrite and people are less likely to listen to me, okay, I don't care that I'm seen as a personal hypocrite. The question is therefore whether or not any, like, that story comes to light at all, whether or not anyone knows that these orders have been given, that these things have happened. We think this happens on a much, much larger scale on our side. We get almost no responses to this analysis in terms of this systemic change. What do we get told? We get told the hypocrisy thing. We don't think that actually responds to any of this. But second of all, we tell you this is just the most important thing in this debate. Why is this the most important thing in this debate? What we tell you is that individual people individually stopping themselves from committing these acts is incredibly, incredibly unlikely for all of the mechanisms that opening government already told you, which means that if the problem here is in terms of creating those systemic changes, that is the only way in which we're actually likely to get any change. Some very few people might tomorrow take the action to stop that they haven't today, but we think that it is a tiny number of people, and we think that those systemic changes are much, much greater. Second of all, we tell you that even if there was some people who it is in their conscience and they would stop, most of those people would do that right now. Because if you literally think that you're about to shoot an innocent person or super beat them up or anything like that, then when you're allowed to, you're likely to stop that today anyway, because you have that level of empathy, if you have that level of conscience. The number of people that opening government are actually affecting in their behavior is minuscule. The extent to which we're changing the narrative, the extent to which we're putting the focus on the people who need to have the focus put on them is massive on our side. If we want to stop police brutality, we need to focus on the real problem. We do not need to blame the people on the ground who do not have access to making those systemic changes. Before I continue, I will take opening. Yes.
The fact that you refuse an order usually does not lead to more police brutality. Therefore, it will not add to the already existing narrative of bad apples.
I genuinely didn't understand that POI. Do you want to say it again? Sorry.
So the fact that you're going to refuse orders doesn't lead to more police brutality. So it's not going to add to the already existing narrative of bad apples.
Right. Yes, we know that refusing an order doesn't increase police brutality. We think it's incredibly unlikely, but we think that what it does is lead to all of the mechanisms that we talked about in terms of not fixing the systemic problems at the top. That is the thing that we're talking about. Okay, cool. Then let's move on to talk about this question of police and trust, because here what we get up in terms of legitimacy is just the claim that individual people on the ground should be able to make this decision for themselves. We say that this is not the most important thing in this debate. We say that individual people on the ground, often one, don't have access to the actual necessary information to make this decision in that moment. That is to say, they're not aware of the full details of the operation. They're not aware of exactly of the fact that there's another operation going on that forces them to say, have to bring in this individual that they're not aware of. They're not aware of the fact that someone else has seen that this other person was holding a weapon and therefore they have to shoot. They have to be able to respond in those split-second decisions and to not have to be making them for themselves. We also think that the people around them have to know that they are making this in order to be careful, in order to know that this person has their back, that if they're told that they're given an order, everyone is going to respond accordingly. Why is this so important? One, we think principally people have these police officers who are giving the position in terms of endangering their lives, have the right to this protection and the right to the understanding that they are going to be protected by the people around them. But second of all, we think that the likely situation is that otherwise you get much worse. If what you're worried about is anyone ever refusing an order, because this is now the thing they do, your vetting of who you're letting onto your police force and who you're letting around you means you're much less likely to allow people with the conscience on. For all those reasons, please oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and indeed both teams on the top half. To begin for the closing debate, we welcome the member of government. Here.
In this amazing open final full of ESL speakers and Miriam, the bitter Kalman, we are extremely happy to stand in closing government. Our case is in direct engagement with OO. Firstly, that the police officer will refuse the order and in the right cases, and this allowance is the specific data that will allow that, and this causes us to enable the systematic change and strong public criticism against the comparative of internal investigation and lack of transparency that are the root causes for the systemic failures that OO is talking about. Therefore, all of my rebuttal would be integrated. Let's talk about our first case, where we will have these going against the grain. Firstly, we think a burden here is that they actually have the opportunity to do so. They have the opportunity to go to refuse the order in the appropriate time. This happens because police officers, when they're a patrolman, which is the lucky case, answers a call and is not deployed in advance. This is your mission, go and do that like a soldier. They hear there's something here, there, and there, go do that. OG talked to us about protest. We think that most of the cases are the George Floyds of the world, the Eric Gardners. Like you see somebody acting in some way and you respond to that. Specifically, you respond as a policeman by reading the situation, by the information that you have on the spot. Now, why this allowance makes the change in the relevant moment? Let's talk about the psychology of the police officer. Police officers make decisions by gut feeling and training. Both of them are required to make the decisions. Now, we think we have a training that tells you this is a bad response, and if anybody, a superior officer tells you to do that, you need to refuse. This is what are your rights as a police officer to refuse? Secondly, what is an illegitimate order? And specifically, what is an illegitimate order that you need to refuse right now? Why is this kind of training likely to happen? Because once you have this policy at large and police departments want to appear to the public as hearing public pressure, as being reliable, which is massively in the interest of police departments to have cooperation with local communities, with the community at large, they need to have this training as an inherent part of this motion. If you allow them to do that, you need to explain to them when they are allowed to do that. Note that in the comparative, as OO say, all of the training is for obeying the hierarchy, and even therefore, even if you have the gut feeling of this is wrong, that person isn't a danger to me, you firstly don't know what to do with it because you didn't have the training, and you're primed very hardly against that because you're primed to obey your superiors. Also, you always consider the option that you will be fired, and now you have procedural defense against that. Now, let's engage with OO while they refuse in the right cases, because what are these kind of cases? Firstly, these are cases where the person you're arresting is unarmed and helpless, maybe erratic and hard to predict, but not dangerous. And also, if they're running away and therefore they are not dangerous, but my superior officer or the one next to me still says, shoot, 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 they're dangerous. Note that these are people that we rely on in general to have the right response to these situations. But now, as I will say, all of the rest of the training is for cooperation with your fellow officers. Obey the hierarchy, obey orders. That means that's a pressure not to refuse. That means that if you feel the gut feeling of this is wrong, I need to refuse, it's obviously the specific cases where you should refuse the order, right? That means that you're going to save a life in that specific case, but only if you have the training that to fortify your gut feeling, to tell you what to do, and to give you the legal protection against retribution in this case, which is what happens under the motion. Now, what happens in the day after the motion? After we refuse this systematic change by the mechanism of trial and doing away with those bad apples. We get now the reveal to the media, to the bad actors and their bad practices that OO so desperately note. The comparative here in status quo. You have internal investigation by internal affairs that are run by the police, like internally. And that's true for a lot of countries. These things are not transparent, and you have a huge incentive to clear the name of the officers that perform the police brutality, because these are people you know. You have the reputation of the precinct to consider, and the city, and pressure from your superior officers. There's a culture of loyalty, the thin blue line that exists in any police force, and also the fear of the police officer to report because they're an accomplice. That means that for framing, that's not only for the US, but note the tension in OO's case. They say they talk about systematic problems that they say themselves mostly only exist in the US. Our case doesn't depend on that, but even if you only fix things in the US, we think that's a huge benefit to our debate. What happens in trials? Before that, let's take seal.
Who do you think is better able to make a decision about the use of violence or not? Someone who has been biased by his own experiences, or someone who is highly educated, has political accountability, and has the incentive to be liked by the voters?
What's your delta here? Eventually, the police officer will still have to make the decision. That's symmetrical in this debate. We prefer a world where they have more of that training than the opposite, where you don't have in your world. Let's talk about trials. The police officer that refused the order is now a witness in 2 different trials. He's a prosecution witness in the police brutality trial against the police officer that gave the order and performed the brutality, and he's a defense witness in the trial of the suspect that was arrested brutally. That won't happen otherwise, because that police officer won't come forward because of his fear, because he's an accomplice, because he's protected behind the thin blue line, and he hasn't performed the mental leap of, I need to report this, this is bad, I need to happen, this happens in our world. Now you have the public exposure of bad officers, and they're doing away with this, and bad commanders, but also you have the public exposure of bad procedures, because the prosecutor is going to ask that officer on the stand, why were you put in that spot? Why were you told to do this thing? What is your departmental policy in these cases, exposing all these kind of things that don't come to the public any other way? Also, as another mechanism to that, you get more other policemen refusing the order, because they saw the bravery and personal example of that singular officer. This leads to more and more in a positive circle, and there's no deterrent against that you see from the others now. That means that we are now able to purge the bad apples, to purge the bad procedures, and have this systemic change that we simply don't get any other way, specifically not in the status quo that ops are defending. And therefore, we are so proud to propose this motion.
Thank the speaker for that speech. And now to begin the extension for side opposition, we welcome the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Perfect. All right. Three, two, one. Panel, opening opposition wants more scrutiny on the structural issues in the police force. The problem is that they set up a massively high burden of proof for themselves, namely that those ingrained issues are now suddenly going to be solved at the moment this narrative slightly changes, and that therefore the changes that need to be so significant in order to really do anything about the problems can really have impacts. I don't think they prove that within this debate. We're going to do it the other way around. We're not going to say that there's necessarily going to be significantly more scrutiny to the level that the problems at the structures are going to be changed. No, we're saying that the liberalization of individual police officers is the most likely thing to lead to more police violence, as you normalize and accept the idea that individual police officers are the right ones to make the judgment calls in situations. Note that when the police officer, I don't know his name, put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, he was not following an order, right? He was racist and he thought he could do what he wanted. We think police brutality, although widespread, like opening opposition says, is a problem that exists in the individual police officer who is not trained and who is often racist. Therefore, we think giving them more freedom to act upon their own decisions is likely to lead to more problems. That is how we are going to win this debate from closing opposition today. Before that, let me quickly do a few points of response. Note that opening opposition says that there is less scrutiny on the structure of the police. I think there are two issues that they need to prove that they didn't at the end of this debate. First of all, I don't know why that scrutiny would become so significantly more, right? In some individual case of a police officer, internally, there might be a little bit of change. Sometimes a media article might be slightly differently written. I don't think that proves that there will be significant change. We think the police doesn't, the problems at the top of the police are difficult to solve because people don't want to, for example, give money to spend money in order to improve the police force, because a majority of the population doesn't even think in the first place that problems in the police force exist and think that that it's currently fine, and that people and because the problems are so significant. Therefore, I think they don't necessarily prove that. Second of all, I think it is their burden of proof. It is enough to overcome the ingrained power that currently exists in the police. I don't think they do that. So at the end of the day, although I think their idea is smart, their impact is just relatively marginal at best. Closing government says, now we're going to get better training. But this is, their entire case is also reliant on that idea that that better training would happen that much, right? We think their mechanisms aren't necessarily better than those of opening opposition, which means probably it'll fall somewhere in the middle. It's kind of a wash. Nothing will really happen. But second of all, note that at the moment, they don't necessarily prove that training will that significantly improve, because note, currently it is really bad. Currently, all their impacts fall the other way, right? Because then you are giving them freedom, but without the ability in order to fulfill that freedom. We're going to explain why giving them this freedom is something that is incredibly bad to do. Note that following an order, not following an order, can mean lots of different things. It can also mean shooting despite someone telling you to disengage because you think that it is a situation in which it is absolutely necessary from your own moral perspective. For example, to save someone else, or for example, to help your fellow cop. Those are also things, no thank you, that mean not following orders. It also means, for example, not helping someone who is asking for help because you think that is something that you shouldn't be doing at that point in time. Why do we think that the problem at the individual level of the police officer is the biggest problem, and therefore giving them more liberty is something that is a very bad idea? Note that opening opposition explains that orders are sometimes problematic due to issues at the top. We think that that is true. However, we think the issues at the bottom and the individual police officer are even larger for three reasons. First of all, they have much less training and much less experience, right? Which means they are much more reliant on sort of limited information, limited knowledge, limited skills in order to be making decisions. We think people at the top also have an incentive to avoid certain scandals, which means probably they can make better decisions about what is less likely to lead to scandals or to issues than people at the bottom. Second of all, we think people at the bottom are more likely to be racist for three reasons. First of all, they are generally less educated and from a poorer background than the people at the top, which unfortunately correlates with being more racist. Second of all, we think these people are less publicly scrutinized and less held to account by society, which means that they have the ability to be racist. And third of all, we think they are way more exposed to the things that radicalize cops and often make them racist. For example, violence or black neighborhoods with a lot of crime or something. Those are often things that make police officers at the bottom more likely to be racist, because they have to encounter them every day. Third of all, we think they are in a much more urgent situation than the people in the office at the top, which means they are less rational and more reliant on their intuitions and their instincts in order to make judgment calls. Those are more likely to be your biases than the people at the top who can think about it, rationalize about it, discuss about it, and then give the order. Why then do we, so therefore we think that the people at the bottom are significantly more likely to be racist and make racist and bad decisions that lead to worse outcomes than the people at the top. Why will this lead to the liberalization of police officers? First of all, this narrative requires the underlying assumption that a police officer, one, is the only one who can truly know what the right choice is in a certain situation, and second of all, is someone who has the ability to make this decision in the best possible way and better than anyone else. Second of all, this legitimizes the idea that a police officer acting beyond the scope of their authority can be something that is legitimate. What is the result of these underlying things that this policy justifies? First of all, we say it is much more internalized by police officers the day they start with their training and the day they come into the police force, that they are ultimately the one who can make their decisions and that is fine, instead of that they have to listen to other things. Therefore, they themselves internalize the idea that they can make the right decision, can deviate from those orders. We think that is bad because they are worse actors for making those choices. Second of all, we think these things are also pushed through the accountability mechanisms. Rather than the sheer fact in the status quo that deviating from the order is enough to fire you or to sue you in court, there is now the extra necessity to prove that that individual didn't make a decision based on his own moral conscience and didn't have justification for making that conscience. Therefore, we also think that holding these individuals accountable is significantly harder. And that is also what OG wants, right? Because they want to not fire these people that deviate from the norms. Panel, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. And now to conclude for side government, we welcome the whip speaker. Hear, hear.
You're muted
You may
still?
still be muted, so you may have to start again.
Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, embarrassing.
No worries, it's happened to all of us.
Okay. Very proud to be here. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Closing opposition tell us that the officer that lied on George Floyd wasn't filling orders. This ignores the fact that, first of all, this was the commanding officer in the scene ordering the 3 other men to lie on top of him. Secondly, that there are police protocols that actually guided this kind of misguided behavior. 2 points in my speech. First of all, where do we get more systematic change? Secondly, why is systematic change of police brutality the biggest impact in this debate? Before that, a few points of extraneous rebuttal. First of all, they tell us, closing opposition tell us we're not going to get better guidance under our side, better training to officers. This just ignores all of the analysis that talks about why this is in the interest of police stations to show that this is part of the communal help and stuff like that. Why, when you give the officers the right to actually deny and go against an order, you actually need to explain to them which situations this happens in. Then they tell us in a lot of situations they're going to deny orders to shoot and decide to shoot someone out of the black. We just think this isn't likely because we already explained to you why the training is more focused on denying violence and stuff like that. Because in a lot of situations, if they feel danger, they're allowed to shoot. Note, even if they don't have a clear command, but now we explain to them why when they do have a command, they don't have to do it if they don't feel endangered, if they don't feel that this is the right thing. So we just get more of this under our side because of this communal responsibility. Secondly, we just believe that the training to police officers are really, really long. We can make them longer if it's like the mechanistic problem. Closing opposition tells us they don't get enough of trainings. But lastly, regarding the fact that police officers have more racism throughout time. First of all, we already answered what kind of morals people have in kicking the scene, and each and every officer knows how to assess all of these things. But 2 other responses. First of all, there is no delta, right? They're not talking about any other actor in the motion. by the motion that says that these are commands, we're talking about their commander giving them these commands, which is as biased as all of these police officers, because he is experiencing all of the same problems that they're describing day by day. So we just think honestly that under our side, that under their side, there is no change on once a lot of this happens today. And lastly, our case deals with this, right? Because once, not all of the police officers are as racist as people in the KKK, and they actually feel some hurt pain inside when they're beating up, when they see someone beat up, then these are people that are much more likely to report other people and be in the trials that we talk about. We just get more systematic change. Why is this true? Note, at this point, closing opposition doesn't have a standing case. We should be above that. Opening opposition tell us that there are problematic, systematic problems that you don't discover. Note, why do they tell us? First of all, the media. Note that you don't change the media narrative in any way, right? A lot of situations, these people are already filmed and they are already accused by the media because it is much more liberal than a lot of the police officers. We honestly don't understand why there is delta. Secondly, they tell us, look, police officers are just going to throw responsibility down the line. First of all, you need to know that if an order was given, then the police officer that denied the order is not the one responsible. The officer that actually went after the order is responsible. This just means that the order is the problem as well in this situation. So this doesn't change how much responsibility changes in this situation. Secondly, this assumes that when something happens, the officer that listened to an order will be the one responsible and not the ones above him. Lastly, if people just deny more orders, we just believe this is less police brutality, and that's better. But moreover, we have bigger impacts than this. Opening opposition tell us there is not going to be systematic change because now we're not going to know that there are bigger problems. First of all, we just show you why there are a lot more cases that are revealed under our side. This means that there is a lot more information. How does this happen? Few things. First of all, once this police officer is a witness from the defense in the arrest trial of someone who was beaten up, this just means that now we have information because this police officer needs to report himself as someone that denied an order and didn't want to do this in the first place. This just means that in a lot of situations, we're going to have so much more information about what happened in the scene and be able to now know how to make all these changes. Secondly, when we tell you that there are going to be a prosecution witness against the trial, this just shows you that a lot of situations, why are they going to do this? First of all, because they were in the scene. Secondly, because the ones that are hurt from police brutality are going to look for them. All the NGOs will want to do this. Lastly, there are videos showing this police officer actually denying this order. This means that they're going to be summoned to court when this happens. What does this prove to you? This proves to you that the more we have more people reporting all these stuff, we have just much more evidence, which leads to much more public outcry because we know that now police officers are felt guilty. Lastly, we just say they're much more likely, police officers are much more likely to get into jail. Before I explain that, opening.
If CG's incentives for better training, which is what they rely on to get people to actually refuse orders, exist, then they exist on our side of the house and they can already implement the systemic changes anyway. The difference is they reduce incentive to report after the fact. This is
No. They can't refuse an order because then they would be prosecuted because they are guilty under your side for being accomplices. Under our side, they are not. This means that they have every reason to report this. Now, open government tells there are situations where police officers are going to go against violence. We explain to you something much larger. First of all, why each case of police brutality just leads to future prevention. Why? First of all, because you accuse the offensive officer, you kick them out of the police because now you have a trial and people are witnesses. This means that we just get this police officer not offending other people. Secondly, because we change the entire system, because when we have this training, when we have a lot of more information, we're much more able to know the exact changes that we want to do. Why is this the biggest problem in this debate? Opening opposition tell us, look, there are a lot of other alternatives, right? First of all, note that when we have internal affairs or legal sanctions against this person or loyalty, then we're not able to prosecute all these officers. We actually showed you why this changes because now they have the incentive to report them. Lastly,
all the alternatives of diversifying the police, it's really hard to accomplish this in each and every place in the country. We just believe that this is inefficient. Honestly, we're really happy to propose.
Thank the Speaker and the whole of the government bench. And now to conclude for the opposition and the whole of the debate, we'd like to welcome the opposition whip speaker. Hear, hear.
In the majority of countries, putting your knee on someone's neck is banned because it is excessive violence no matter what you do. In the majority of countries, you're not allowed to shoot first because that is something that puts citizens in danger. The problem we face today is not that the commands given aren't good, is that police officers refuse to listen to them. Under our side of the house, we can hold them to account. We don't empower them to fall into their racist biases, and we can fire them. That is something that all leaves on our proposition case. I think the problem is they pretend that individual police officers are better able to make decisions than commanding officers are. I think that is ridiculous. What I'm going to talk about today is, one, I'm going to talk about the general police force, what happens there, which I actually think is a wash in the majority of the debate. But two, I'm going to talk about how we think that there is going to be more good orders refused by bad police officers than bad orders refused by good police officers. So comparing So on to what happens to the justice system. I think that comparing ourselves from opening opposition, there is simply no comparative on their side of the house. Listen, the reason people were upset about George Floyd wasn't because we felt like individual police officers got a certain demand. It's because everyone saw a 7-minute video of someone telling police officers, "I can't breathe," calling for his mother, and then people in officers' uniforms continuing to put their knee on their neck. I think accountability like that on the system is going to happen under both sides of the house. Under our side of the house, however, we can say that was against guidelines, that was against commands, that is not something you should do. So I think that mainly all of the justice system is just simply a wash, especially since Miriam does a great job at explaining why training is not a sexy topic. It doesn't become more sexy when people aren't actually, can't object according to their consciousness stuff. So I think that means OO is out of the debate. Then, when it comes to closing government, when they say we can reveal the bad apples and kick them out, here's the important thing here. Revealing the bad apples means that they have to make very bad decisions. Two responses. One, we can also reveal bad apples because racist policy goes against commands, goes against guidelines, goes against everything you should do, which means we can fire you. Under your side of the house, it's more difficult to fire bad apples, as David has explained to you, because those bad apples are empowered to make individual decisions because you as a police officer on the ground are the one person who can make this life or death decision. Your commanding officers knows shit. The training of CG has told you for many, many years that your commanding officer is not someone you should listen to that much because your individual thinking skills are so important. Bad apples are more likely to get away with it under their side of the house. Okay, moving on to the actual most important thing. Is there going to be more police violence, more brutality? I think what David explains to you is the issues in the police are not an issue at the top, but they're an issue at the bottom. One, whilst difficult, it is easier to hold people to account at the top than it is to hold them account to the bottom, right? I think that those are not the people who are going to be in the media. Those are not the people who have to defend themselves. Those are not the people you actually know. That doesn't mean that there's not systematic issues in the police. It means there's fewer systematic issues and there's fewer racism at the top than there actually is at the bottom. Two, David explains to you that it is far more likely that these people are highly educated. CG then says, oh, but we'll do training and we'll make training really hard. I'm sorry. I think one, training is such a boring topic that literally no one wants to fund that. I don't think that has anything to do with the responsibility we give people. I'm sorry. We give police officers a fucking gun. They're able to shoot people. I think that means we have an incentive to fund people, but they're still underfunded. So I think under their side of the house, they're going to have a training which says you should make your own decisions, but then they never actually get any sort of training and never get the ability to make decisions. Then lastly, what David tells you is that police officers are extremely biased. You parole in the most poor neighborhoods. You parole in the neighborhoods with minorities. Your commander does not. Your commander in the majority of countries is very likely to come in via a different stream. If we all would apply to a police officer, to like the police academy, very often you would be trained to become a commander, not necessarily someone who patrols on the street. I think that means that they are far more, so I think that those commanders never had that experience. They're far less likely to be biased. I think too, given the fact that you now are more likely to lose your partner or feel violence or be beaten up, something like that, I think that increases bias and a confirmation bias. Under our side of the house, I think police officers are trained to continuously make quick judgment decisions based on their gut feeling. That gut feeling is bad. Under our side of the house, you don't have to make a decision based on your gut feeling because your commanding officer has told you what to do and has given you the guidelines. Those guidelines are far more likely to be good than racist, which is something under their side of the house. Closing government responds to that by saying you still have to make decisions under both sides of the house. Two responses. One, I think there's way less wiggle room. Look, I think in the majority of cases, you're being told to parole in this particular neighborhood, check every 10th car you see for drugs. Under their side of the house, if you feel like talking to a black person first and only checking up black cars, you're able to do it because you're told you know more than your commanding officer, you know better than your commanding officer, you're the individual that can make that decision. You're more likely to listen to those types of guidelines and there's less wiggle room. But two, I think very often there's going to be direct commands. Do not engage, do not shoot, do not use lethal force. That doesn't happen. I'll take a PY from opening government.
The vast majority of orders are given by your immediate superior or small local police chiefs. Those are, by our own analysis, which was responded to, people who just made it through the police longer and were selected by older people who also presumably did not have the most progressive values. Why are their decisions good?
Okay, so I think one, most countries have national guidelines and have like national leaders, right? I don't think this is about the US where you can simply go rogue, but I think two, you're still far more likely to have commanding officers at a higher level, right? State levels do have commanding officers which go down. I think thirdly, given the fact that you do make some sort of a promotion, you're far more likely to be held to account than anything that happens under their side of the house where individual police officers, at least now we get the best police officers making the best decision. Comparing us directly against opening government tries to claim that very few people will actually refuse, and this will only happen in extreme cases. This goes again directly against their entire analysis in CAP, which was quite great, which is that people will feel empowered to make individual decisions, and they'll think that they are the ones that are ultimately held responsible. The issue is that even if police officers feel individual responsibility, that doesn't mean that they make the best decisions. They'll feel responsibility to then make the best decision and to make a judgment call and to do something they feel good at. But what David explains to you is that what police officers feel good at is usually not the right thing. We want to politicize orders. We want the Black Lives Matter movement to have influence over orders. We want them to be able to hold the police to account. That's something that doesn't happen under their side of the house. Opening government then says you can only order more violence, not less. I think that's bullshit. You can tell them you have to use different steps in escalation. You cannot use lethal force that happens under our side of the house. Look, I think this is a debate about who's best able to make decisions. I think individual police officers are horrible at making decisions. We should limit their ability to make these decisions. That's why we ask you to oppose.
We thank the speaker for that speech and indeed everyone for a fantastic debate. Once again, congratulations to all teams for having made the Eudc Open Final. Woo! So yeah, hope everyone enjoyed the debate, and I guess the judges and I will deliver it, and results will be announced in due time.